My child, stop scrolling for just a moment, because what you are about to hear was not meant to pass before your eyes unnoticed. There is something waiting beneath the surface of a story you thought you already understood, something quietly hidden behind old words, unfinished conversations, and a chapter from your soulmate's past that may not be as simple as it once appeared. Stay here. Do not rush away. This is not a message of fear, and it is not a message asking you to judge anyone. It is a message about clarity, about the way truth eventually rises when the heart is finally strong enough to see it. And tonight, in this fictional spiritual story, heaven is drawing your attention toward one detail that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. There was a time when your soulmate believed the past had been completely closed. They told themselves that what happened before you belonged to another season, another version of themselves, another life almost. They tried to carry forward only the lessons and leave the confusion behind. But some chapters do not end simply because two people stop speaking. Sometimes an old chapter leaves behind questions. Sometimes it leaves behind assumptions. And sometimes, my child, it leaves behind one truth that was never spoken clearly enough. That is where this story begins, because someone connected to your soulmate's past has been hoping that one particular detail would remain buried beneath silence. Not because it is dangerous. Not because something terrible is coming. But because if you understood what truly happened, you might finally understand why your soulmate looks at you the way they do now. Pause here and listen closely, because the first revelation is smaller than what is coming later, yet it opens the door to everything. Your soulmate's ex once believed they understood exactly what your soulmate needed. They believed they knew how your soulmate would react, what they would tolerate, what they would forgive, and what they would always return to. Familiarity created confidence. Confidence slowly became assumption. And somewhere along the way, that assumption became the biggest mistake in the entire story. Your soulmate changed. Quietly. Deeply. Long before anyone around them realized it. There came a point when the things they once accepted no longer felt acceptable. The conversations they once avoided suddenly needed answers. The compromises they once made started feeling like pieces of themselves being left behind. Yet almost no one saw the transformation happening because your soulmate did not announce it. They simply began becoming someone new in silence. And this is where you enter the story in a way you may not expect. You were not necessarily the cause of that transformation. You were something more mysterious. You became proof of it. When your soulmate encountered your energy, your character, your way of seeing people, or simply the possibility that a connection could feel different, something inside them recognized how far they had already traveled. That recognition was powerful. It did not necessarily happen all at once. It may have arrived in small moments. A conversation that stayed in their thoughts longer than expected, a kindness they were not used to receiving, a calmness that felt unfamiliar, a strange sense of being understood without having to explain every wound. And their ex, somewhere in the background of this emotional history, began to realize that the version of your soulmate they remembered no longer existed. Do not skip what comes next, because this is the point where the hidden detail begins taking shape. The ex may have assumed that your soulmate would eventually compare you to the past and decide that familiarity was stronger than possibility. But the opposite happened. Your soulmate began comparing the past to what they were learning about themselves now. That difference matters. They were not necessarily choosing one person against another. They were choosing one version of themselves over another. They were asking questions they had avoided for a long time. Who am I when I am not trying to keep everyone comfortable? What kind of love allows me to remain myself? What does it feel like to be valued without constantly proving my worth? Why did I once confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth? Why did I accept uncertainty when my heart was quietly asking for peace? Those questions changed everything. And here is the part the past would rather remain misunderstood. Your soulmate's ex may have once believed that your soulmate left because they stopped caring. But the truth was more complicated. Your soulmate began stepping away because they finally started caring about their own emotional clarity. There is a difference. Sometimes people leave a chapter not because every feeling disappears, but because they recognize that feelings alone cannot build the future they need. Affection without trust becomes exhaustion. History without growth becomes repetition. Familiarity without understanding becomes a room that feels smaller every year. Your soulmate may have learned this the difficult way. And once they learned it, they could never completely unlearn it. Something extraordinary is hidden inside that realization, my child, and I want you to stay with me long enough to hear it. Your soulmate did not simply walk away from an old relationship. They walked away from an old pattern. That is what the ex may never have fully understood. The visible ending was between two people, but the invisible ending was between your soulmate and the person they used to be. The one who over-explained. The one who waited too long for clarity. The one who accepted mixed signals because they were afraid that asking for certainty might push someone away. The one who mistook patience for endless tolerance. Slowly, your soulmate began to recognize that love should not require the disappearance of the self. And then something happened that the ex did not expect. Your soulmate started speaking about the future differently. Not loudly. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But differently. Friends may have noticed it in passing. Family may have heard a sentence that sounded unusually certain. There may have been a moment when someone casually asked your soulmate what they wanted from love now, and instead of avoiding the question, they answered with surprising clarity. They wanted peace. They wanted loyalty that did not need constant testing. They wanted someone they could grow beside rather than someone they had to continually recover from. They wanted a relationship where silence was comfortable instead of punishing, where vulnerability was not used as leverage, where affection was not offered and withdrawn to create uncertainty. And when your soulmate described those things, there was something they did not say aloud. The qualities they were describing had begun reminding them of you. Stay till the end of this part, because that is not yet the biggest revelation. In fact, it is only the beginning. The ex eventually sensed that something had shifted. Maybe they noticed your soulmate stopped responding in the same emotional way. Maybe an old memory that once had power over them suddenly became only a memory. Maybe the ex tried to revisit something from the past and discovered that the emotional door no longer opened as easily. There was no dramatic battle. No grand scene. Sometimes the strongest closure happens quietly. A person realizes they no longer need the explanation they spent months wishing for. They no longer need the apology to heal. They no longer need the past to admit what happened in order to move toward the future. But there was one thing that still remained unresolved, and this is why the past has not completely disappeared from this story. Your soulmate's ex knew something about your soulmate's feelings that you may never have been told. Something said during the final stage of that old relationship. Something your soulmate admitted at a moment when they were emotionally exhausted and no longer trying to protect appearances. It was not your name. It may even have happened before you became important to them. Yet those words predicted exactly why someone like you would eventually matter so much. Listen carefully. Your soulmate once admitted that what frightened them most was not losing a relationship. What frightened them most was reaching the future and realizing they had spent years inside a connection where they were never fully known. That confession stayed with the ex. And now you can understand why your presence became significant. You did not need to be perfect. You did not need to rescue your soulmate. You did not need to prove yourself every second. Something about the way you entered their emotional world made them feel seen in a place where they had once felt invisible. Maybe it was the way you listened. Maybe you remembered something small they mentioned only once. Maybe your honesty unsettled them because they were accustomed to people saying what was convenient. Maybe there was an unusual softness in the way you treated their uncertainty. Whatever it was, your soulmate recognized something they had asked for long before meeting you, the possibility of being known without performing. Do you understand why this matters? The ex did. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. And that is when another layer of the hidden story began. There may have been a conversation between your soulmate and their ex after you had already become emotionally significant. It may have been brief. It may have happened indirectly. It may have been disguised as ordinary closure. But beneath the surface, the ex was searching for an answer. They wanted to know whether your soulmate had truly changed or whether this new connection was temporary. They may have asked questions that sounded casual while carrying deeper meaning. Are you happy? Is this serious? Do they really understand you? Are you sure you're not moving too quickly? The words themselves were not necessarily remarkable. What mattered was your soulmate's response. Your soulmate did not defend you with exaggerated promises. They did something far more revealing. They became calm. That calmness said more than excitement ever could. In the old chapter, your soulmate may have spent countless hours explaining their feelings, defending their choices, trying to convince someone to understand them. But when the subject turned toward you, something had changed. They did not feel the same need to prove what they felt. They simply knew that whatever was growing deserved protection from unnecessary interference. That quiet certainty unsettled the ex because it revealed something unmistakable. Your soulmate was no longer emotionally available to the old dynamic. And there is more. The ex may have realized your soulmate had told you things they once struggled to tell anyone. Not necessarily secrets, but truths, fears, dreams, regrets. The private parts of themselves that only appear when trust begins to deepen. Maybe your soulmate mentioned a childhood ambition they had stopped talking about. Maybe they admitted the kind of future they secretly hoped to build. Maybe they told you about an insecurity they normally hid behind humor or confidence. None of these details seem dramatic alone. Together, however, they formed a pattern. Your soulmate was opening. The ex remembered how difficult that once was. And suddenly, the meaning of your connection became impossible to dismiss. Something huge is waiting just beyond this moment, because the greatest hidden truth is not about jealousy. It is not about competition. It is not even about who loved whom more. The real revelation is about timing. Your soulmate's previous relationship may have unknowingly prepared them to recognize something they would have overlooked years earlier. Pain taught discernment. Confusion taught them to value clarity. Emotional inconsistency taught them to notice stability. Being misunderstood taught them to treasure genuine curiosity. And when you appeared, they were finally capable of recognizing qualities they might once have taken for granted. That is why your soulmate sometimes seems surprised by their own feelings toward you. You may have wondered why they occasionally become quiet after a meaningful moment. Why they pull back for a second when things feel especially real. Why something simple between you can affect them more deeply than dramatic gestures ever did. It may be because your soulmate is experiencing a contrast they cannot easily explain. They are noticing how different it feels when connection does not require constant emotional survival. They are discovering that peace can be powerful. They are learning that love does not always enter like thunder. Sometimes it enters like finally putting down a weight you forgot you were carrying. Do not leave yet, because another piece is about to fall into place. There was possibly one moment when the ex directly or indirectly asked what made you different. That question may have stayed unanswered outwardly. Your soulmate might have changed the subject. They might have laughed it away. They might have said, "It's complicated." But inside, the answer was already forming. You made them feel that the future did not have to resemble the past. That was the difference. And once that realization arrived, your soulmate could no longer look backward in the same way. But the ex knew something else, something your soulmate may not realize was remembered. During one of the final honest conversations from the old chapter, your soulmate described the kind of person they hoped they would someday meet. They did not describe appearance. They did not describe status. They did not describe perfection. They described a feeling. They said they wanted someone whose presence felt like they did not have to keep guessing. Someone who could challenge them without humiliating them. Someone who could be strong without becoming cold. Someone whose affection felt sincere rather than strategic. Someone who would inspire them to become more honest with themselves. And now the uncomfortable truth for the past is this: those words began resembling you. Maybe not perfectly. No human connection is perfect. But enough that your soulmate noticed. Enough that the ex noticed too. This is where the story becomes more mysterious, because sometimes another person recognizes what is happening before the people inside the new connection fully admit it. The ex may have seen your soulmate becoming more thoughtful, more grounded, more intentional. Maybe their decisions changed. Maybe they started talking about goals they had postponed. Maybe they became more protective of their time. Maybe they stopped returning to arguments that once consumed them. And while everyone else saw ordinary personal growth, the ex understood the deeper significance because they knew what your soulmate had once said they were searching for. They were becoming ready for the kind of connection they once thought might not exist. And your presence coincided with that awakening. My child, do not mistake this message as a promise that every unanswered question in love has a predetermined supernatural explanation. This is a fictional spiritual story meant to reflect something deeply human. Sometimes the reason a new connection feels powerful is not because the past was meaningless, but because the past taught someone what they can no longer ignore. Your soulmate's history does not need to compete with you. Its greatest purpose may simply be that it taught them how to recognize what deserves to be protected when it finally appears. Yet one final detail remains. And this is the detail the ex may have hoped you would never discover. At some point, after recognizing that your soulmate had changed, the ex may have said something unexpected. Not directly to you. Perhaps not even directly to your soulmate. It could have been spoken to a mutual friend, a relative, or someone who knew enough of the history to understand. The ex admitted that they had seen your soulmate emotionally invested before. They had seen attraction. They had seen attachment. They had seen excitement. But they had never seen your soulmate become this afraid of losing something meaningful. That sentence changes the entire picture. Because your soulmate's occasional hesitation around you may not mean what you thought it meant. You may have interpreted silence as distance. You may have interpreted caution as uncertainty. You may have wondered whether they cared enough because they did not always express themselves in the dramatic way you expected. But sometimes a person becomes cautious precisely because something matters. After disappointment, the heart does not always rush toward what it wants most. Sometimes it approaches slowly, testing whether the ground is real. Your soulmate may be doing exactly that. They are not only asking, "Do I want this?" They are asking, "Can I trust something this important?" And the ex recognized that question before you did. Stay with this, because the deepest revelation is coming closer now. The ex did not necessarily hope you remained unaware because they wanted to destroy your connection. The reason may be far more human. If you discovered how differently your soulmate speaks about you, you might understand that the old chapter no longer has the power it once had. And that truth forces the past to accept its finality. There is grief in finality, even when people know a relationship was not meant to continue. There is something humbling about realizing that someone once struggled to imagine life without you and now dreams about a future that no longer includes you. The ex may have been protecting themselves from that realization. But your soulmate was moving forward whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Then came the moment no one expected. Someone close to your soulmate asked a question about you. It sounded innocent. Almost too ordinary to matter. They asked, "What is it about this person that has changed you so much?" Your soulmate went quiet. Not because they lacked an answer. Because they had too many. They thought about the conversations no one knew about. They thought about the moment you made them feel understood without demanding an explanation. They thought about a sentence you probably forgot saying. They thought about the strange peace that sometimes appears after speaking with you. They thought about the part of themselves that had started imagining possibilities again after years of protecting themselves from disappointment. And then your soulmate said something that traveled farther than they expected. Something the ex eventually heard. Something that changed the way the ex understood your place in this story. Your soulmate said, "They make me want to stop running from the life I actually want." Those words mattered. Because the ex remembered something from years earlier. Something your soulmate had once confessed during one of their most vulnerable conversations. Your soulmate had said, "I'm afraid I'll recognize the right person one day, but I'll be too guarded to let them close." And suddenly, the ex understood. Your soulmate was not afraid that you were the wrong person. They were afraid of repeating an old mistake with someone who might actually be right for the next chapter. That realization created a silence no one could easily break. But there is still one missing piece, and this is where part 1 must leave you, because the next revelation changes everything you have just heard. The ex knew about one conversation your soulmate never told you happened. It took place after your name had already become important. Your soulmate was asked a direct question about what they would do if they were forced to choose between staying emotionally attached to the comfort of their past and risking everything on an uncertain future. Their answer came immediately. But that was not the shocking part. The shocking part was what your soulmate said immediately afterward, when they believed no one else would ever hear it. And when the ex discovered those exact words, they finally understood why your connection had become impossible to ignore. There are moments, beloved child, when a single sentence carries the weight of an entire chapter, and this was one of them. Your soulmate had been asked what they would do if they had to choose between the familiar comfort of their past and the uncertain possibility of a completely different future. They did not hesitate. They did not ask for more time. They did not hide behind a careful answer. They simply said, "Would choose the future." But what followed was what no one expected. After a long silence, believing the conversation would remain private, your soulmate added, "Because for the first time, I know who I would regret losing." Stay here, because those words were not spoken casually. They came from someone who had spent a long time questioning their own heart. Someone who had once believed that uncertainty was simply part of love. Someone who had learned to protect themselves by expecting less, revealing less, hoping less. Yet something about you had disturbed that old emotional strategy. You had made it impossible for them to remain comfortably detached. And when their ex eventually learned what had been said, the meaning was unmistakable. The past was no longer competing with another person. It was competing with a future your soulmate had finally allowed themselves to imagine. What happened afterward was even more revealing. Your soulmate began looking at memories differently. Old photographs no longer carried the same emotional gravity. Old conversations that once replayed endlessly in their mind became quieter. Questions that had remained unanswered stopped demanding answers. This did not happen because the past became worthless. It happened because healing changed the way your soulmate carried it. There is a difference between remembering something and still belonging to it. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that difference, and their ex could sense it too. Do not skip this moment, because the next detail changes the emotional direction of everything. There was something the ex had never admitted openly. For a long time, they believed that if enough time passed, your soulmate would eventually look backward. They believed nostalgia would soften the difficult memories and amplify the beautiful ones. They thought familiarity might someday feel safer than beginning again. Perhaps they expected a message. Perhaps they expected an accidental conversation to reopen an old door. Perhaps they simply believed the bond they once shared would always hold a special power. But then you appeared in your soulmate's emotional world, and something unexpected happened. Your soulmate stopped romanticizing what had hurt them. That shift was enormous. Suddenly, they could appreciate what had once been beautiful without pretending everything had been healthy. They could remember good moments without using those moments as reasons to return. They could forgive without reopening doors. They could wish someone well without believing that person still belonged in their future. And this emotional maturity frightened the past more than anger ever could, because anger can sometimes mean attachment remains. Peace is different. Peace often means the heart has stopped fighting with what happened. Your soulmate was finding that peace. And somehow, thoughts of you were becoming part of it. There were evenings when your soulmate found themselves remembering something you had said. Not necessarily anything dramatic. Maybe you encouraged them when they doubted themselves. Maybe you asked a question nobody had asked before. Maybe you noticed when their smile did not match their mood. Maybe you gave them room to speak instead of rushing to fill the silence. Whatever the moment was, it stayed with them. They would replay it later and wonder why something so simple felt so powerful. The answer was slowly becoming clear. They were not accustomed to being emotionally noticed without first having to ask. That realization opened something inside them. And their ex knew exactly how significant that was. You see, the ex remembered a version of your soulmate who struggled to communicate their deepest needs. They remembered someone who would say, "I'm fine," while quietly hoping someone would notice they were not. They remembered the moments when your soulmate withdrew because explaining themselves felt exhausting. They remembered the emotional walls, the unfinished conversations, the misunderstandings. So when they heard that your soulmate had begun opening up around you naturally, they understood something others could not. This was not simply attraction. Something deeper was changing. Your soulmate was beginning to feel emotionally safe enough to be known. Stay until the final word, because there is another revelation hidden behind this one. The ex discovered that your soulmate had started protecting your name in conversations where you were not present. Not through confrontation. Not through dramatic declarations. Something subtler happened. Whenever someone tried to reduce your connection to something temporary, your soulmate refused to participate. Whenever someone joked that they would eventually lose interest, your soulmate became unusually serious. Whenever someone compared you with the past, your soulmate quietly changed the direction of the conversation. Why? Because they did not want what was growing between you to become entertainment for other people. They wanted to understand it before the world began naming it. That is important. Some feelings become weaker when they are constantly displayed. Others need quietness while they are forming. Your soulmate sensed this. They were learning that not everything precious needs an audience. Some things need protection while they develop roots. But it was not necessarily hesitation. It was intention. Your soulmate had learned that meaningful things should not be handled carelessly. And you had become meaningful. Pause here, because what happened next surprised even your soulmate. Someone asked them whether they still thought about their ex. Your soulmate answered honestly. They said yes. But before anyone could misunderstand, they continued. They explained that remembering someone and wanting them back were completely different things. They said certain people remain part of your story because they helped shape who you became, but that does not mean they belong in every chapter. They said they had stopped wishing the past could be rewritten. They had started feeling grateful that they had learned what they needed to learn. Then someone asked, "So what changed?" Your soulmate became quiet again. And eventually they said, "I stopped asking who I could go back to, and started asking who I could move forward with." Those words traveled. Eventually, they reached the ex. And suddenly, the hidden emotional truth became impossible to avoid. The ex understood that your soulmate had not erased the past. They had outgrown the need to return to it. But something else was still hidden, and this is where the story becomes more personal. There was one reason your soulmate had not told you everything about their feelings. It was not because they wanted to deceive you. It was not because another person secretly held their heart. It was because admitting the full depth of their feelings would force them to confront something they had avoided for a long time. Hope. Hope had become frightening to them. After disappointment, people sometimes become comfortable with expecting nothing. Expectations cannot hurt when you refuse to create them. Dreams cannot collapse when you refuse to imagine them. A guarded heart often convinces itself that detachment is strength. Then someone arrives who makes the future imaginable again. And suddenly, the walls that once felt protective begin feeling like a prison. You became connected to that realization. Your soulmate started imagining things they had stopped allowing themselves to imagine. Ordinary things. Meaningful things. A conversation at the end of a difficult day. Someone celebrating their smallest victories. A person beside them when life becomes uncertain. Laughter in places they had not visited yet. Peace after disagreements instead of emotional punishment. Growing older while still feeling understood. They did not necessarily tell anyone these thoughts. But they had them. And once those thoughts began, they could not completely stop them. The ex sensed this before knowing the details. Something in your soulmate's language had changed. Instead of talking only about today, they occasionally spoke about later. Instead of saying I, they sometimes accidentally said we. Instead of avoiding discussions about commitment, they listened more carefully. They started asking questions about what makes relationships last, what creates trust, what helps two people grow without losing themselves? These were not random questions. Your soulmate was quietly studying the future. And somewhere inside that future was the possibility of you. Do not rush past this, because another hidden piece was about to surface. The ex remembered an old argument in which your soulmate had said something painful but revealing: "I don't want to spend my life begging someone to choose me." Years later, those words still remained. And now, your soulmate had encountered a connection that made them question something entirely different. Not, "Will someone choose me?" but, "Am I brave enough to choose what I truly want?" That was the transformation. The old wound had been about being chosen. The new challenge was about choosing. Choosing honesty over avoidance. Choosing communication over assumptions. Choosing vulnerability over emotional distance. Choosing a future based on who they had become instead of who they used to be. And this is precisely why the ex hoped certain details would remain hidden. Because if you understood how deeply your soulmate's perspective had changed, you might stop interpreting every cautious moment as rejection. You might recognize that some of their silence came from trying to handle powerful feelings responsibly. But there was another reason. The ex had once heard your soulmate describe their greatest regret from the relationship. It was not what anyone expected. Your soulmate did not say, "I regret loving them." They did not say, "I regret staying." They did not even say, "I regret leaving." They said, "I regret how many times I knew what I needed to say and stayed silent because I was afraid of what would happen afterward." That regret followed them. And now, with you, history was beginning to approach a similar crossroads. Your soulmate had something they wanted to say. Something they had almost said more than once. Perhaps there was a conversation where they paused halfway through a sentence. Perhaps you noticed their expression change and wondered what they were thinking. Perhaps they wrote something and erased it. Perhaps they rehearsed a confession privately and then decided the timing was not right. Whatever form it took in this fictional story, the emotional struggle was the same. They wanted to speak. Fear told them to wait. Their past told them what endless waiting could cost. And that tension was becoming impossible to ignore. Something was moving toward a decision. The ex recognized it because they had seen your soulmate hesitate before. They knew the signs. The unusual quietness. The overthinking. The tendency to prepare for every possible outcome. But there was one difference this time. Your soulmate was no longer asking themselves whether their feelings were real. They already knew. They were asking what to do about them. That question changed everything. One evening, your soulmate sat alone with thoughts they could no longer distract themselves from. Their phone was nearby. Your name was closer than they wanted to admit. They thought about reaching out. They thought about telling you something honest. Then they imagined all the ways the conversation could go. What if you did not feel the same? What if they said too much? What if they ruined something beautiful by naming it too soon? But then another question appeared. What if they remained silent and lost the opportunity completely? That question stayed. It followed them through the evening. And strangely, the answer did not come from excitement. It came from memory. Your soulmate remembered the relationship they had already lost. They remembered every sentence left unsaid. Every moment when pride won over honesty. Every time both people waited for the other person to speak first. They remembered how silence can slowly create distance where love once existed. And suddenly, they understood why the past had returned to their thoughts. Not because they wanted to return to the ex. Because they refused to repeat the same emotional mistake with you. This is the hidden gift buried inside the old chapter. The past had become a teacher. And you had become the person who made the lesson matter. Stay with me, because the next moment was extraordinary in its simplicity. Your soulmate opened a conversation with someone they deeply trusted. They did not mention every detail. They did not need to. They simply asked, "How do you know when something is worth risking your comfort for?" The person answered with another question. "When you imagine losing it, what do you feel?" Your soulmate went silent. Then they said, "Like I would always wonder what could have happened." That answer revealed everything. Because regret had once defined the ending of their past. And they did not want regret defining the beginning of something new. The trusted person then asked, "Are you talking about them?" Your soulmate did not ask who. They knew. For a few seconds, nothing was said. Then your soulmate smiled. It was the kind of smile that appears when someone has been discovered without being exposed. They looked away and finally admitted, "Maybe." But the person sitting across from them knew, maybe, was hiding something much larger. They asked another question. "What scares you?" Your soulmate's smile disappeared. And this time, the answer came from somewhere deeper. "That I'll wait too long." Those 5 words were the turning point. Because your soulmate had finally named the real fear. It was not the past. It was not the ex. It was not another person. It was time. They were afraid that while they tried to become completely certain, life would keep moving. They were afraid someone else might recognize your value while they were still deciding how vulnerable they were willing to become. They were afraid that protecting themselves too perfectly could cost them the very connection they were trying to protect themselves from losing. And when the ex eventually heard that your soulmate was afraid of waiting too long, something inside them understood the significance immediately. They had heard those words before. Years earlier, during the final days of their own relationship, the ex had told your soulmate, "One day you're going to meet someone who makes you want to say everything you kept inside with me." At the time, your soulmate dismissed it. They thought it was simply an emotional statement spoken during an ending. But now those words had returned. Because there was something your soulmate wanted to tell you. Something they had never been brave enough to say in exactly this way before. And the ex realized that their old prediction might actually be happening. But there was still one secret the ex possessed. One final piece that explained why your soulmate had become so emotionally affected by you. It came from a conversation long before you knew any of this. During that conversation, your soulmate had described one unmistakable sign they believed would tell them they had finally met someone capable of changing their life. They had laughed when they said it, almost as if they did not believe such a person existed. The ex remembered the exact words. And recently, they discovered that the exact thing your soulmate once described had happened with you. Not approximately. Not symbolically. Almost exactly. That was why the ex became silent when your name was mentioned. That was why your soulmate had been behaving differently. And that was why someone close to both of them finally decided that you deserved to know what had been hidden. Because the sign your soulmate described years ago was not about attraction, beauty, money, status, or chemistry. It was something far more intimate. Your soulmate had once said, "If I ever meet someone who makes me feel safe enough to tell them the truth I've never told anyone, I'll know that person is different." And recently, your soulmate had decided to tell you that truth. They had already chosen the words. They had already imagined the moment. They had even made a private decision about what they would do depending on your response. But before they could speak, something happened. Someone from the past discovered what your soulmate was preparing to reveal. And what that person did next was something neither your soulmate nor you had expected. And the ex noticed that protection. Perhaps that was when they understood the truth they had resisted most. Your soulmate was treating this connection differently because they had become different. The old version of your soulmate might have rushed. The old version might have confused intensity with certainty. They might have told everyone everything before understanding their own emotions. They might have made promises while still trying to understand what they wanted. But now they were slower. More deliberate. More thoughtful. At first, that caution could look like hesitation.